Hey everyone, thanks for joining us this morning, this evening, this afternoon, wherever you're joining us from the world. Happy to be here today on another Ask the Howlers with Tom Kellermann and myself, where we're going to be discussing our Modern Bank Heists Threat Report version 5.0, the Escalation. As always, I am Rick McElroy, Principal Cybersecurity Strategist for VMware Carbon Black, and I am super happy to be joined this morning by my good friend, my good partner, my good running mate all over the world, Tom Kellermann. Tom, how are you this morning?
I'm doing well. This is fun. I'm glad we get to speak to the people and provide them some insight as to what challenges the banks are facing.
Yeah, and I think, look, it's been really interesting on our side, right? I mean, this is our fifth year. It's sort of our seminal report that we put out every year. Lots of folks always ask, like, why do we pay so much attention to the financial sector? Like, what's happening over there that makes it applicable to the rest of us in cyber? I find those findings, frankly, I think always interesting. I know that finance and that sector faces a more advanced adversary in a lot of cases. You know, these adversaries are well funded. They're coming after not only the actual currencies, they're coming after cryptocurrencies, they're coming after market strategies. And we're going to talk about all of that stuff today. But before we start on that topic, I'd like to talk a little bit about who we are and what we do for the cyber community, right? So I'll start with our involvement as the Howlers. You can think of us as the thought leadership team that really works with prospects, customers, and the larger InfoSec community to really promote InfoSec. And then I think bring together a collective tool set to bear on the problem so that we can all get better as a result. So that's really who the Howlers are and what we do for the community. But TK, more importantly, let's talk about what we're doing from an organization's perspective to be involved in the wider cybersecurity community and have influence over some of the changes.
Yeah, you know, VMware has demonstrated a true commitment to cybersecurity, as illustrated by being a founding member of the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, and all of our work with the cyber fraud task forces of the Secret Service and InfraGard writ large. We understand that we are critically important to the security, the systemic security of the technology sector. We do actually implement our own security capabilities. We are constantly refining them as we are customer zero. And then we get involved in other initiatives. For example, in 2020, I was appointed to the Cybercrime Investigations Advisory Board for the Secret Service. I highly recommend anyone who's tuning in to join your local cyber fraud task forces. This is going to take collective action from a public and private perspective to actually deal with the challenges we face today, because frankly, there's an insurgency going on in cyberspace.
Yes, there is. And I know one of the awesome efforts that we just went through as well is bringing, you know, our technology, our platform out there to really start training some of these investigators on incident response, on threat hunting. And I was super happy to see the participation, especially out of the Denver community in that. And so we just hosted 40, 50 LEOs in our platform to start, you know, walking them through gathering artifacts and doing this, you know, from a scale and cloud perspective. Talk to me a little bit about, because I know, hey, the Secret Service, you know, they've participated, you know, on a go-forward basis as part of the report. And so just talk a little bit about our commitment there as well and what we're doing to train those folks.
So for those of you who are not aware, you know, Secret Service was the first law enforcement agency ever created. It was created right after the Civil War to deal with counterfeit currency. And they were part of the Treasury Department up until 9/11. But they are wholly responsible for all financial crime investigations across the financial sector. And they are on the front lines of, you know, criminal investigations associated with cybercrime and in the financial sector specifically. Yes, the FBI collaborates with them, but Secret Service actually runs point. And the dedicated agents therein, you know, necessitate greater information sharing and collaboration with other cybersecurity vendors to get the job done, because frankly, there are not enough of them. They're insufficient in terms of human capital and resources to actually deal with the scourge of the modern day cybercrime cartel. And so we, as Howlers and as the greater community of VMware and Carbon Black, we constantly support the cyber fraud task forces. We're working heavily to assist in dealing with the modern kill chain associated with the financial sector. And we are firmly committed to not only providing thought leadership and information for those investigations to be effective, but more importantly, to making sure that the VMware infrastructure itself is insulated and protected from the phenomenon of today.
And looking through the report, right? So I know what stands out to me, but I'm interested, right? So you're the author, sort of the generation of the report, but this year in particular, if you had one finding that came out of the report that you had to talk to folks about, what's the key change that we've seen from an adversary perspective, or what are they doing that makes this year's report interesting?
So there's a e-fraud finding, and then there's a cyber kill chain finding, right? So from an e-fraud perspective, I think it's fascinating that the majority of institutions, 130 of them that were interviewed here, noted that non-public market information was being targeted by the adversary to conduct digital front running and digital insider trading. Just imagine if you knew what a major European bank's position on the international currency markets would be on September 1st, and you were to take that position ahead of time. And this aligns well with the conversations that have been had throughout both the law enforcement community and the cybersecurity community, that there are 4 rogue nation states that comprise an axis of essentially evil in cyberspace that are offsetting economic sanctions through financial fraud. And a lot of these sanctions that we see imposed on Russia right now, you have to understand that I would estimate that over 50% of the dark web economy of scale feeds back into the ecosystem of the Russian cybercrime cartels and allows for these oligarchs to continuously receive revenue and funding that offset those sanctions. So it's important to note that they're shifting. Yes, wire transfer fraud was up, but targeting of non-public market information is definitely something we need to pay attention to as it's here to stay. From a cyber kill chain and attack perspective, you guys hear me say this all the time, but the game has changed. They really want to hijack your digital transformation and use the infrastructure of the institution to attack their constituency. And that was up by 58% this year. So they're recognizing and appreciating, like, it's one thing to rob the bank, it's a whole nother to, turn it into a hostage situation and use the bank to attack other banks or attack their partners, et cetera. So those were really stood out for me in terms of systemic challenges facing the sector. Which finding did you find most interesting?
There was a couple, and I'm going to peel it back from like a tactical TTP, where we saw an uptick to I think this idea of attacking time. So this was something that we actually noted in the last report. We've noted it in our global incident response reports as we're talking to our incident response teams that are deployed across the globe, looking at these types of breaches. I think the phenomenon, interestingly enough, and for the purposes that I would do it as an attacker, we're really around manipulation of log data, trying to defensively evade tool sets, and/or something like endpoint detection or response that records it, sends it up to a cloud somewhere, and trying to evade that. But to your point, I think the game's really changed inside of the financial sector, and fraud now looks much differently, right? And it's much harder to pattern what that fraud looks like, especially if I'm manipulating time inside of an environment, or delaying a market action so that I can then take a market action and make a better bet, and become more realistic. Now, what I really start to think about is how scary that actually gets if you look at the number of breaches that have occurred over legal entities as well. So now I can start to fuel this market information, or where a particular financial institution is going to make a bet with merger and acquisition information, or whatever the case may be from a legal perspective. And so I think, look, when TK and I talk about some of these advanced adversaries, we cannot talk about one of these breaches in a vacuum. It's just simply, I think, incorrect to ignore the piles of data that have already been pilfered, the massive amount of recon information that I now have on entities that I can then use to blend in with their activities, perform a bunch of this stuff. And so I think for me, being able to manipulate reality, which is something that I think we've reported on before, and actually, bringing this fundamental question of what's true, what actions were actually done by an approved entity, which actions weren't. And we know in a botnet world where transactions occur, in microseconds, that this becomes a massive problem, I think, today and in the future. And definitely, I think, something to pay attention to if you're outside of the financial sector, but are and a lot of organizations do, perform those activities as well. So I think that was the one that really stuck out to me, is the massive increase in, Kronos attacks.
And from a tactical perspective, I would say that 94% of these financial institutions were grappling with a new attack vector, attacks on their APIs. API security is woefully inadequate across the board. And as many of these major financial institutions engage with smaller fintech vendors to obviously reach the future retail customer base through virtual currencies, they're creating a massive amount of risk for themselves. And what makes it even more problematic is if the API itself is hijacked, the entire ecosystem relying on the API could be used to island hop. And so not only is API a new vector per se, that's 94% of them are dealing with, but it also becomes a platform for island hopping. And so much more attention must be paid to DevSecOps, security of APIs in general, and assessments and attestations provided by fintech vendors that they're actually doing and conducting best practice associated with that.
And TK, look, I mean, the industry, we've been talking about island hopping as a phenomenon for a long time, right? I think the first case that I can remember where it sort of got big press is really around Operation Aurora, right? So like 2007, you got Google, the DoD, a bunch of public entities being breached by some massive APT actor. No one knows. Sort of the birth of endpoint detection and response comes out of that, right? And, all of those activities. But island hopping in and of itself, I think, is also starting to change, right? So I want to just drill in on a point that you made, which is really around this idea that I'm an attacker, right? And I don't want to leave. I actually don't want to do a standard data exfil because someone's probably deployed some network detection and response, something like that, so they're able to see when I'm trying to do data exfil. Now, instead, I'm going to live inside of this environment. I'm going to move really low and slow. I'm going to misuse a bunch of good known services. I'm going to go after Active Directory, all the things that we know the attackers are doing as part of that, upfront kill chain. But talk to me about, what's the impact to an entity when your brand is used to attack your customers, or when one of your partner networks is used to facilitate attacks and/or fraud, from connected entities.
Yeah, so for those of you who right now are saying this is just a supply chain attack, I say no. I say no because you're thinking in a very narrow lens that it's limited to the technology sector, and an adversary that'd be willing to leverage a supply chain attack against you is not willing to then hijack your digital transformation and use it against your constituency. And that's just false. Any adversary that likes to island hop will continue to island hop all the way down until they're stopped or disrupted. Number one. Number two is, this is a material risk that represents a reputational risk. And this type of phenomenon is the reason why there was such concern expressed in this report with the security with shared service providers within the financial sector. This finding in and of itself is also why the SEC is on the road to mandate that CISOs report directly to boards and brief them on a regular basis to the security posture of the institution and organizations. And I really think that we need to understand that in terms of the low and slow, that we're seeing a renaissance of rats in the Linux environment, which is allowing them to maintain that persistence. And so for those of you who are hearing my warning right now, who are in charge of cybersecurity for a financial institution, you should be conducting robust threat hunting right now for the existence of rats in your Linux environments. And I know you've got some color to add there, Rick.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, look, our threat analysis unit published a report, I think like 2 months ago. It's fairly fresh on the market, but it's really around, what we refer to as the resurgence of rats, but more specifically, how frequently Linux environments are being attacked. And now, if you think about it, it makes a little sense, right? As compute starts to flip, as the number of devices, as the number of containers, as we're, building out modern app architectures, those are sitting on top of Linux with containers. The attackers have obviously started container attacks, and they're going to move to a place where folks have little to no visibility, which way we know they do. So look, again, the same strategy that you're going to need to protect any operating system, you're going to need to do that for Linux. Now, maybe you may have punted in your environment. Maybe you have, put that risk level a little lower. We're telling you, hey, go retake a look at that assessment. Go look at that thing and maybe bubble that up from the perspective of the attackers, because they are spending time on it, and they're spending an inordinate amount of customization on their code in those environments as well. If you want to learn a little bit more, definitely go check out our latest, threat analysis unit report on, Linux and rats. And speaking of which, TK, I think the other one that I'm trying to get a really realistic sense of, right? Because you see a ton of vendors on social media, a ton of vendors in their marketing information, putting out a whole lot of stuff around, the idea that attackers have started to become more destructive. And look, I'll say we've participated in that. If you go back to RSA 2019, myself and Greg Foz, delivered a talk about how ransomware was really collapsing with the destructive attacks, and so sort of showing the evolution that these attackers were doing to include, writing specific ransomware that doesn't actually ransom things. It just starts to delete files. Now, our initial supposition, and I think correctly, was that this was done in a purely punitive fashion up front, right? I.e., I'm not going to pay, therefore, as an attacker, I'm going to burn that entity to the ground, or burn their data, or continue to delete things until they created enough sense of urgency that they have to pay me. Right. I think secondarily, we saw that used from a counter incident response perspective, deleting log files. I don't think that was a big issue there. All of that being said, we've clearly seen, customized modules in ransomware, custom destructive attacks itself, especially after what occurred with WannaCry and NotPetya closely being coupled with those. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening geopolitically. We know there's a whole bunch of new code. A whole bunch of our partners have some analysis along with us over that. But, what really concerns you there, TK? I mean, is this they've spent enough time inside of our critical infrastructure and financial sector, they understand it, and now are close to initiating those attacks, or where are we from a destructive perspective?
I mean, just yesterday, the Five Eyes issued an urgent warning of an imminent destructive attack campaign against critical infrastructures, unprecedented declassification of information, unprecedented collaboration between the Five Eyes nations, their intelligence communities, their homeland security agencies to share this information with the world. The sector realized a 17% increase in destructive attack year over year. It's not just limited to ransomware. You've seen 8 novel new wipers deployed since January 13th, custom built by the GRU and the cybercrime cartels of Russia. We discovered a latest one just recently, the Rus ransom, which targets your backups first and overwrites the data. It may or may not choose to ask you for ransom, but your data's not coming back. What's interesting, this is to bring it back to the rat point, is stop thinking ransomware is always going to come through spear phishing. Just stop. It's being distributed in many cases because there's a pre-existing backdoor into your infrastructure because of a rat. If you can't identify where that rat is, you're more than likely going to deal with a ransomware attack. And on average, according to Mandiant's latest study, you'll deal with it within 5 days of them actually getting a foothold in the infrastructure. What's problematic here is because of the Pax Mafioso that exists between intelligence services of those rogue nation states and the cybercrime cartels, many times that access that the cybercrime cartel may already have is now being shared. And if there was a great way to get revenge against the West for economic sanctions, it's this. Destructive attacks within the financial sector, destructive attacks that overwrite data, that manipulate the integrity of data, that manipulate the value of time, and inevitably use the institution to attack their customers and partners.
And I really do think, at least based on some of the latest research I saw on the Sandworm and some of these other groups, that activity is actually occurring. Again, attempting to answer back for global sanctions that were, levied against a particular thing.
Let's hold there real quick. So Sandworm was quasi-dormant for a couple of years. Forgive me if I'm wrong, for those of you who know better, but they were quasi-dormant, and they came back out because they were called upon to be patriotic. And then they launched Cyclops Blink, which was like a botnet for firewalls, very elegant, very interesting. And had the FBI and the NSA and the international community not disrupted Cyclops Blink, it would have been the attack platform for distribution for destructive payloads like Hermetic Wiper, like the dev payloads that Microsoft discovered, et cetera. And if you think about it, though, because of that Pax Mafioso, you need to pay attention as well. The Emotet and TrickBot, yes, they're back again. They will be used as distribution platforms, again, for destructive payloads. And so when you're trying to stop destruction, you need to be doing a better job of identifying rats. You need to be looking for the IOCs and TTPs associated with TrickBot, Emotet, and Cyclops Blink. And you need to pay close attention to the CISA Shields Up campaign because, again, historic, unprecedented information sharing occurring through CISA and the JCDC.
Well, that's excellent that you brought that up. It was definitely something I wanted to bring to the discussion, but we actually have a question around that, right? So how do we feel about information sharing between the feds and the community? How can we make it stronger? I'll start with my statement. Mm-hmm. I've been doing this a while. I started in the mid to late 90s. This never used to exist. right? A shields up campaign was unheard of, and no one would have even tried to get that done. There was no CISA, there was no DHS. So what I can say from my perspective as a defender is that we used to beg for help. We used to. I don't know if people remember the initial hackers that went up to Capitol Hill with Mudge and crew, right? Like, we were out of the room, out of the deal. Now we're in the room, in the deal. And I can speak to this last public-private information sharing session that occurred because I was on the phone call for it. I mean, the FBI, DHS, CISA, the Secret Service are all presenting back to private companies and really trying to give what I think is security leaders the right information to empower them to walk into their executives to say this is a serious issue, and hey, for the next month, maybe we need to hold off on projects, maybe we need to shore up, and maybe we do need to get back to getting our shields up over this period of time of heightened concern. But TK, I mean, you've advised the White House, right? You've sort of seen this journey as well. But talk to me a little bit about where we are information sharing today versus 20 years ago.
Well, first of all, I want to tip my hat to the leadership in the U.S. The leadership team for cybersecurity, from the NSA to the National Security Council to the FBI to the Secret Service to CISA, some of the most thoughtful, strategically minded, collaborative leaders I've ever seen in cybersecurity. Yes, most of which got their DNA through the NSA. I don't care. There's not one big brother in the world. There are many. And so we need to appreciate the fact that they are trying to do the right thing because they recognize the US government cannot protect all of the critical infrastructure in the US. It's not scalable. So how do you empower that collective defense? How do you wage a counterinsurgency in American cyberspace? And how do you do so not just with sharing information? Look at the unprecedented levels of disruption leveraged by the FBI or the NSA into known cybercrime cartels infrastructure or spy groups infrastructure that has slowed down the destructive campaigns that we speak of here. However, they're not going away. And I really think yesterday's proclamation, warning by the Five Eyes collectively, which would never do such a warning, and it's never done a collective warning on cyber ever before, is something we need to pay close attention to because there's a clear and present danger ahead of us.
Yeah, I agree. Look, I mean, I think we've still got a long way to go when it comes to backhauling technical threat intelligence. And I love the energy coming out of, the new executive orders that are going to call for an unparalleled, unprecedented sharing of information amongst that. We're going to need to figure out how to scale it, how to build a solution so that we can actually abstract some things. Because obviously, if you're watching an advanced adversary for a while, you're probably not going to release all of the information you have on them while they're doing the things, which is part of, I think, what we're going to need to do as part of the private sector to advise, the public sector on those things. But TK, it's interesting in this particular report to take a little bit of a left from what we were talking about. We know, and I think, on almost every interview I see with you, where we talk about, they used to want to steal the money. They used to want to get into the vault, obviously cart off, the dollar bills from, if we're talking, a physical bank robbers. But now it's moved to a hostage situation, right? However, I think there's a component that came out on the report that clearly points to a weak, vulnerable safe where we're just keeping currencies and people are ripping them off, which is really around crypto exchanges, right? So, I've been following the crypto market for a super long time. I remember reading the PDF on, Bitcoin when it was first published. It's a little bit of a geek thing for me, right? I've mined coins, I've done all of those things. So I pay attention, right? I think I probably pay attention more than most consumers in that market, certainly. And I certainly pay attention to these pop-up crypto exchanges that occur all over the place. But the phenomenon I want to really tie into is, especially as we're looking at exchanging, now it's not just cryptocurrencies. Now we're doing digital assets like NFTs, all of these things. We've assumed blockchain is going to save us from all of these attacks. However, I would largely argue, I think, along with Moxie and a whole bunch of other people that have looked at this, that we're building a brand new world on top of a really old, crusty, bad foundation. Meaning, you've talked about this, TK, API security. I think in a lot of cases, these crypto exchanges are not even implementing some of the fundamental controls we would see in a basic financial institution that started today, right? So I think two components for you on that. One, do we think that in the end, cryptocurrencies are actually going to be a highly regulated market, much like any other financial market? Secondarily, recommendations for folks who are looking at becoming a crypto exchange or participating in these communities. What can they do now to really start to think about that someone's going to come in and burglarize their safe and steal the currencies?
Well, they themselves can learn a lot from the banks. So if you go back to the history of electronic finance, the World Bank, IMF, the central banks of the world decided that, hey, we can move money digitally in real time without a delay, because before they had a T+1, they had 1 day delay. So if anything went wrong, they could unwind the transaction. We can do straight through processing, increase liquidity, yada, yada, boom, boom. We're going to use PKI because PKI is untouchable. But PKI had a fundamental flaw. If you hack the certificate authority or if you hack the private key from the endpoint that accessed it. Now, I'm going to say something right now that's going to make everyone into a tizzy. But I just say, this whole virtual currency blockchain thing is distributed PKI. In fact, the guy who created blockchain, the gentleman actually used to work at a PKI vendor before he did that. So when you think about it, it also has the same challenges. So the various organizations that operate as an exchanges, not all are equal. They don't invest with cybersecurity appropriately. They don't actually understand how to conduct cybersecurity because they do rely on either perimeter security or blockchain security far too much. And then they don't actually have a capacity for you to defend yourself and your wallet therein from some sort of nefarious attack. One thing from this report that stands out, which shouldn't stand out, which is ridiculous that it's happening, was the #1 attack vector of infiltration into the institutions. Well-defended institutions were application attacks. Well, why have we not figured this out yet? Now, I know, let's talk about application control, because why are you not deploying it, and why is it not in high enforcement? It's too much? It's too cumbersome? It bothers your developers? Well, Rick?
Yeah, look, I think this is one that kills me, given the amount of effort that the community has spent on things like OWASP and even being able to laser focus development teams around 10. Just go after the OWASP top 10 and maybe you're going to make the attackers' lives harder. I think, look, generally speaking, I think from a vendor perspective, we have some work to do as a community to essentially create safe guardrails for people to develop in, that they can deliver with the speed that they need to, that the businesses are demanding them to do that. I think there's some great new solutions on the market, especially when you look at app modernizations and containers in a multi-cloud world. And VMware, I think, certainly has a lot of those solutions. But I think to your point, if it doesn't have a program, if they're dedicating one person to their entire security efforts, you can assure that those efforts will probably fail, regardless of how heroic that singular person performs. And lots of us have been in that seat. But look, I think also for consumers, a conversation we need to have as a group is around, consumer rating things like this. Like, which exchanges are good? Which ones do I, should I be able to put the app on my phone and connect to to my cold wallet? All of those things. I think it's just entirely cumbersome. So a lot of people are playing in this new world, but aren't actually educated about those risks. Now, TK, as we're starting to come to the end of our session today, right? And something that I know near and dear to each of our hearts is like, great, these are huge issues. What can we do about it? So one piece of tactical advice for teams who find themselves at risk for some of these attacks, and then a piece of strategic advice, and I'll finish with the same.
So strategic advice would be to integrate your security controls, specifically your NDR and EDR, to make sure that you have ground truth and true situational awareness as to the manifestations of these elite adversaries. Tactical advice, ramp up your threat hunting internally with that visibility, specifically focus on rats and Linux systems to root out this adversary before you suffer a ransomware attack, a wiper attack, or something even more nefarious.
That's great advice. Yeah, look, I think tactically, specifically, there's two places to look from a detection and prevention perspective. It's really around lateral movement, right? So we all know the key strategies there: micro-segmentation, and NDR, looking at those traffic flows, EDR as well. But I also think that organizations fundamentally need to really rethink their strategy for authentication. I think in almost most of the cases that I look at, Lapsus, if you go look at what Lapsus is, they were running Mimikatz. Like, that is not something advanced. Mimikatz is still jacking up Active Directory. Active Directory is still spilling out cred. So I think at some point, folks really need to look at enterprise, multi-factor authentication that doesn't rely on a very vulnerable authentication solution in the middle of that. I think that will help interrupt some downstream activities that we see from attackers, like living inside of the environment and turning off policies on your endpoint security tool, or actually turning off the tool itself, or telling SCCM to then go uninstall all of these security agents that your team has bled and done all the hard work over, right? So for me right now, I think strategically looking at these problems, you got to look at Active Directory and authentication as a huge part of that.
And don't forget to spin the chessboard, please. They're not just trying to steal money. They want to hijack your digital creation, your digital persona, your brand of the organization, and they will launch attacks from that. And if you are a tier 1 financial institution, a significant corporation, or you are partnered with one of them, more than likely you will deal with a nation state adversary that will get in. And how you manage and suppress that adversary in real time without it escalating to destruction will be up to you.
Lastly, I would say we're back on the road. You can expect us at RSA. You can expect us at Black Hat. You can expect us probably in your town very soon. We're very public about where we're going. So look, the only reason I tell you that is we love engagement. So please engage with us. You can find us on Twitter at InfoSecRick for myself, at Tack Kellerman for Tom, at _Howlers for the rest of the larger group here at VMware, and then of course at VMware Carbon Black on LinkedIn, on Twitter. Please engage with us. We want to check our work. We want to make sure that we're actually giving you actionable advice that makes sense. But until the next time we see you, on behalf of myself, the rest of the Howlers, and VMware Carbon Black, thank you so much for who you are and what you do. We will see you next time.